Thank you very much, and thank you as well for asking me to be involved in this event. It seems, as you mentioned, very pertinent for this moment in time that, I was going to be doing this talk on, can you see my screen, the first slide at the moment? I was going to be doing this talk on how to maintain relationships whilst traveling and working remotely, but it's now turned into the quarantine version because everyone in the whole world seems to be having to work remotely. Some people have had to go home, so some people will be in different time zones, which is one of the main challenges when traveling and working remotely at the same time. But yeah, thanks again to TopTal and to Federici for putting this event on. And thanks for those who are here. And hopefully there'll be some useful tips and hints from some of the things that I've learned whilst working remotely. So go to the first slide. So in terms of overview, I'm going to split the talk into three sections. The first one will be a little bit about who I am, some of the story of my experiences doing the remote work journey, and then I'll talk a bit about relationships with clients and with yourself, which is also an important thing to do when you're working remotely, because you have to sort of maintain your own routines. You have to be a lot more disciplined than if you're in an office with someone else who's standing over you, potentially telling you what to do. There was going to be another section on relationships with locals when you're traveling, but I've decided to remove that section because it's not relevant to this talk at the moment. And then we'll go into a quick summary at the very end and a time for some questions and answers. So if there are any questions about specifically working whilst traveling, then that will be the best time to ask those things. So my name's Tim. I'm primarily a coder. As Federici said, I help run the Ethereum London Meetup, which is one of the largest blockchain distributed ledger technology events in London. We showcase products and companies that are building on top of specifically the Ethereum blockchain. So if any of you are involved with or know of anyone involved with those kinds of projects, then please feel free to get in touch, and we'd love to give you an opportunity to talk at that event. But my Twitter is on the left there. I post a lot about blockchain stuff and general rants sometimes, and talk about coding because obviously I'm a coder. Ask questions about coding. And the Ethereum London Twitter tag is on the right, just there. I wanted to say as well that I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I have only got experiences that I've had. Everyone else who is working remotely will have a very different and unique set of experiences. However, there will be some similarities between the experiences of people who work remotely. So hopefully some of those key things will be helpful, and I'll share some of the tools that I used as well, which will be one of the most helpful crossovers. So in terms of my story, I started working remotely pretty much when I finished university in 2012. I went straight into being a freelancer, sort of fell into that. And after a year of being a freelancer, I decided that I wanted to work for a company. I worked for a company for 1 year, sort of get a lot more experience. And then after a year of working full-time for a company, I was fed up of it and I wanted to just go back to being a freelancer. So that's what I did. And around that time, the lease of my house came to an end. And I made quite a difficult decision at that time, or quite a brave, I suppose, decision to go and do a trial of working remotely whilst traveling. At the time, I was reading sort of the 4-Hour Workweek and the Lean Startup, which I think are really good books to read in parallel, because the 4-Hour Workweek is there's a lot of ideas in it. Some of them are a bit pie in the sky, I think, but the Lean Startup is a lot more kind of grounded and down to earth and practical. So I took some of those principles from the Lean Startup, some of the agile principles, and decided to apply the build, measure, learn kind of agile way of working to traveling. So I thought my ultimate goal was to go to Brazil for 3 months because I wanted to learn Portuguese. But I decided I'll go to Lisbon because they speak Portuguese as well, although it's quite a different dialect. And it was also closer to home. So I thought I'll trial it. I'll do a build, measure, learn thing. I'll see how it goes. If it works well, I'll go a bit further and iterate on that process, I suppose. So it did. It went really well. I was in Lisbon for 1 month, working remotely, and because of that experience, because that went well, I felt confident to continue doing that thing. And then after that, I went to Barcelona for a few days, but I had a bit of a culture shock in the sense that I realized some of the challenges with working remotely. I realized that I'd left all my friends and my contacts that I've made in Lisbon, and I had to start all over again, and it was like a blank sheet. I think if you're working remotely in your own city, it's easy to sort of keep your contacts and your friends and your family potentially nearby as well. However, when you're traveling and working remotely, it comes with a whole new set of challenges, such as, wow, I literally just left the friends that I've made. I've had to drop my routine, for example. And one of the things that I did, and I think that this applies to people today who are having to work from home, is that routine is so important, and being self-disciplined is so important. And when I went to Lisbon, I did a lot of research beforehand. When I went to Barcelona, I did a lot of research beforehand into co-work spaces and I do rock climbing, so I was doing research into gyms and running routes, and then I was picking my house that I'd stay in based on the proximity of those kind of locations. But I think even now, you see a lot of people on Instagram posting themselves doing exercise routines. You can see the importance and the need for some kind of routine to be maintained when things aren't going sort of as you usually expect them to do. And I think when you're working remotely, as I mentioned, you have to do a lot of maintaining of your own routines. So having that kind of self-discipline is really important. And as I said, when I went to Barcelona, like the challenge of trying to maintain a routine in a different city and another different city and another different city sort of really hit me. And after 2 years, it started to become much more difficult to maintain. I traveled and worked remotely for 2 years before deciding to come back and sort of be based back in London. But when I was in Barcelona, I remember I was in a co-work space, and there were people speaking Spanish or Catalan in the background, and I was so nervous about my client who I was on a call to, hearing people speaking a different language in the background and realizing that I was working remotely, that I sort of freaked out and sort of went outside the building to try and hide that from them, which I realize now is a bit ridiculous because there's plenty of Spanish-speaking, Catalan-speaking people in London. But I realized I was just trying to get over the fear of doing something that I'd not done before. And I think that at the moment people are having to work remotely and get used to a new way of doing things. And eventually I made it to Brazil. I decided to stay there 3 months. And because that had gone well, I decided to travel and work remotely for another year. That's a whole nother story, which I'm going to save for a different time. But I had good relationships with my clients as well. I realized that I'd managed to not only travel and work remotely, but also maintain a good relationship with the 2 clients that I had at the time. And I realized the importance of that, because ultimately what you want is to, building and doing coding work if you're a coder, and then actually having to source new clients they're two different things. And if you can keep the same client for as long as possible, then that's ideal, because then you don't have to do extra work looking for new clients. So I think this is why I think it's so good to focus on maintaining good relationships with clients, as I mentioned before. And a company like TopTal can really help with that, help you to, if it is just a short-term project with a client, they can help you to find new ones if you don't need them. So that does take a whole big burden of sourcing out of remote working. So on to relationships with clients. I was going to say that most people haven't worked remotely, but that's probably not true anymore. We've probably gone, I don't have any specific official stats, but I'd imagine there are a huge amount of people working remotely, and especially in jobs that are able to be remote, like admin jobs, coding jobs. Obviously, there's plenty of jobs which can't, and I think that's one of the challenges of this time, but that's another discussion. But for people who are working remotely, your client or your boss, if you're still in the same country, the team that you're working with, if they can't see you, their imaginations can go wild. Like the picture on the left here, people, when they think about remote workers, think about, someone sitting by a pool, or in a pool in this instance, on their laptop. If you've ever tried this, it's the most uncomfortable thing in the world to do. Your laptop gets really hot on your lap. The sun glares off the screen. So when I was traveling, I made a concerted effort to actually find a good co-work space and go into that co-work space and stay in it. And I also made video calls from those co-work spaces. I didn't have to. I don't think that the client necessarily needs to know where you are, but I did that so that they could see that I wasn't, just sitting on a beach somewhere, and that when I was traveling, I was actually working. So I wanted them to see me in a co-work space so that they had a professional, they could see that I was being professional, and they could see that I was focused on sort of making them feel comfortable, if that makes sense. And I think that's relevant for people who are working at home at the moment. If you're on a call with your clients and you're sitting there in your pajamas or something, it just doesn't give necessarily a very good impression. Someone sent me a WhatsApp video the other day of like a big group call. There was about 8 people on it. I think one of the people on the call didn't realize that people could see her screen, because she goes to the toilet, sits down on it, puts her laptop down. Everyone in the whole call breaks up. But, that just gives a really bad impression of her to her potential colleagues. I was going to say, originally in this talk, I was going to say, this is what you will look like when you're remote working. You're a floating head. However, everyone's a floating head at the moment. Everyone is working remotely. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people are working remotely. So there's a lot of people who are floating heads. And there's an app which has just become super popular over the last few days. Everyone seems to be inviting me to it, called House Party. And it's not just within work, it's like the conference calling has sort of almost made its way into the mainstream now, like massive group conference calling. So everyone is this floating head. But the same principles, if you're in a client meeting, apply to if you're in an office. Go to your stand-ups if they're doing stand-ups. Be present, listen to people. I know it's not always easy if the Wi-Fi is bad, but just show that you're professional and you're committed to the work that you're doing as much as possible. If you're in a different time zone, it's obviously a bit more difficult. But if you can, go to those stand-ups, just show them that you're committed to the work that you're doing for them, even if it's a short-term project, because they'll recommend you to other people. And TopTal and other recruiting agencies want people on their books who are professional and who will give them less work, because if clients are complaining to them, then that's not going to be good for them as well. So, respect your clients, because you might end up working with them for a long time. And for the company I was working for, we eventually ended up, I actually came back to London and then worked remotely, then came back, then worked remotely, and then ended up coming back and staying with them. But built up a good relationship with them. We eventually sold the company to a company in the States. So that was one of the benefits of what I'd say is a good relationship and an ongoing good relationship. Delph, this starts to move into sort of life coaching advice, which I'm going to try and steer away from, but I think it's important to keep a good relationship with yourself, especially when you're having to discipline yourself. If you're remote, you're having to, like I said before, be self-disciplined. And the government has said you're allowed to go out for 1 run per day or whatever. But I think trying to keep up some form of exercise routine, and I'm preaching to myself here as well, but keep up some form of exercise routine is really important. You have to look after yourself, especially at a time where there's not this kind of structure that you're used to. But that's a summary. I'm going to go into the summary, and I'm going to just flesh out the extra points that were in there actually. And I'm going to talk a bit about Delph again on the next slide. But for a client, think about how you're coming across. Like, if you're like that video I mentioned, if you're sort of going to the toilet when you're on a conference call, then that might come across a bit bad. Respect your clients and just communicate with them. Communicate. So just coming back to self, I think it's helpful to ask, if you're in a position that you have the choice to do remote working, and at the moment we don't have a choice, a lot of us are having to do it, but if you have a choice, it's really helpful to ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I wanting the remote work? That's a question to keep asking yourself all the time. And for me, I eventually decided, actually, I don't want to travel and work remotely anymore. I want to stay back and be there in my client's office, because I'm going to learn a lot more about the actual business side of things, as opposed to just being an outsourced coder all the time. How can I BML, which is the build, measure, learn, which is the agile principle. And I try and apply that thinking to everything that I do, even the tools that I use. I try and think, what is this? How can I use metrics to measure what's going on? How can I learn? How can I improve these systems that I'm using within my day-to-day life? How can I maybe replace the task system that I'm using, the task software that I'm using, with something that works better, and what can I learn? I always ask, from a new situation, what can I learn from this situation? Whenever you go to a new client, say, what can I learn from this? What did I learn from my previous client? What can I do differently this time? Just keep iterating on that kind of way of thinking. Pick your tools. The tools that you use are really important. TopTal is a great tool for helping you source new clients. I'm not actually with TopTal, so maybe they provide other services like networking as well. I went to one of their events when I was in Brazil, but I'm not actually part of their organization, but they're a great tool for helping people to find work and for helping clients to find really good professionals. But yeah, other tools that I've used have been, one of the best ones has been OneNote. I know there's a big argument between whether OneNote's better than Evernote or Apple Notes, but I really like OneNote. I use it for a lot of things. And when I was traveling, in my second year of traveling, I decided to move away from OneNote, and that was one of the. I realized I tried to change my systems too quickly, and that caused a lot of chaos. And then I ended up going back to OneNote eventually. But I really like it because it synchronizes really well across all my devices. whereas other software doesn't necessarily do that in the way that I want it to. I'm very interested in hearing during the Q&A if people have any tools or pieces of software or routines that help them to manage especially repeating tasks, because that's something I've not really kind of managed to find a good tool to manage yet. I use Microsoft To Do now. I used to use Google Tasks, but then they sort of changed their interfaces and got a bit messy, I thought. But Microsoft To Do bought Wunderlist, and they've upgraded it a lot, and I really like it. Shift is a good tool. I put all my communications tools within Shift. It's called, their website is Get Shift, I think, or Use Shift. But you can like put all your email clients into one interface. You can put WhatsApp in there. You can put Facebook Messenger in there. So I use it as a communications tool so that I can condense all my communications into one interface. And if I need to communicate, I know exactly where to go. And then, yeah, Google Drive is something else. JetBrains for coding. I think that's probably everything that I needed to say. Q&A, yeah, as I mentioned, what software do people use to manage their routines? But also, how do people think at the moment that this remote working, this time of everyone having to do remote working, how do people think that's going to sort of change the way that businesses work? Is that going to have a knock-on effect? I mentioned earlier about conference calling coming into the mainstream. Do people think that is going to change the world that we're living in at the moment? So those are my questions to people, but if people have other questions, then that'd be great to hear. So back to you, Frederic. And that's my company, by the way.